While all of us can have roadmaps for how to improve things on the nuclear side, on the climate side, we have ideas for how to attack those issues. I don't think anyone has come up with a sensible way of dealing with the misinformation epidemic.
That's the voice of Dr. Robert Rosner, theoretical physicist at the University of Chicago. He, along with Sharon Squassoni, research professor at George Washington University, are today's guests on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, even though we are far apart, it feels like a winter wonderland in both locations.
Yes, indeed, Michelle. And here I thought after the snow and freezing rain of New Hampshire, I would have left that behind. But no, but I had a great snowball fight with my neighbors across the street this weekend. So lots of fun.
Oh, that's great. And I know it looks beautiful, but snow does make travel dangerous. So I really hope everything stays okay so essential workers can make it in. But back to today's show. Tom, what do you have lined up for early warning?
Today, we'll be talking about how the United States and Iran can get back into the nuclear deal. Both sides are essentially saying, you go first, and we will discuss how they can get around that.
After that, Ploughshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher sits down with two members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board to discuss last week's Doomsday Clock announcement. Dr. Robert Rosner and Professor Sharon Squassoni give their take on why we are still the closest we have ever been to midnight and human-caused catastrophe, and what we can do to move towards a safer world.
And lastly, Michelle will be answering a question about visual media and nuclear explosions on this week's Q&A segment. And if you would like your question answered on the air, please DM us at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org. We love hearing from our listeners.
And speaking of hearing from our listeners, if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth from our listeners drives who else gets to hear this. So we appreciate all those recommendations you make to friends. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Del, and welcome to Early Warning. We are going to talk Iran policy today, and to help us do that, we're very lucky to have Mary Kaszynski, the Deputy Director for Policy here at Ploughshares. Mary, thanks so much for coming here again.
Thanks, Tom. Really excited to be here.
So let's get into Iran policy. Of course, as we know, both the United States and Iran are trying to get back to the nuclear deal, after President Trump withdrew from it. And the United States says it wants Iran to get back into compliance with its nuclear commitments. But Iran says it won't do that until the United States lifts sanctions and lets it sell oil. So both are kind of saying, you go first. Which seems like an easy thing to solve, but nothing's easy when it comes to international negotiations like this. So, Mary, help us understand, how do we get around this dynamic?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So, as you noted, this is a really complicated problem. It's not easy. It's going to be a delicate dance and some really delicate negotiations that are going to have to happen between the U.S. and Iran and the other parties to the nuclear deal. The problem is the question of who goes first. Whoever does, it looks like they're conceding. And both the U.S. and Iran are dealing with some complicated domestic politics. So neither one wants to go back home and say we gave in to the Iranians or we gave in to the U.S. This is a problem we've solved before, and that's the good news, right? So these exact negotiations happened the first time the nuclear deal went into effect. And the same kind of thing is going to have to happen again. Full compliance by both sides is not going to happen overnight. So they're going to have to work out and very carefully coordinate, who makes the announcement. Announcements will probably happen in very quick succession. And then those steps to bring both sides back into compliance. So Iran rolls back its nuclear program where it's in breach of the JCPOA, and the U.S. gradually lifts sanctions, in coordination probably, and hopefully quickly over the next few months.
So essentially what you're saying is the answer is they need to figure out a way to both go at the same time in a coordinated fashion. But of course, that takes some discussions and preparation. So is it your impression that those discussions are happening at high levels behind the scenes?
Nothing's been publicly reported. That would be my guess. If those negotiations aren't happening now, they will have to happen very soon. Iran has set a deadline. The Iranian parliament passed a bill where if Iran doesn't get any sanctions relief before February 21st, Iran will start reducing the inspections that it's currently complying with. So they've sort of set a deadline for the U.S. to act. Calls with, and the Biden administration has made this very clear that, it intends to work very closely with European allies in particular. So those negotiations, making sure that the U.S. and the Europeans are on the same page, those negotiations will likely happen first. And then at some point, they'll start talking to Iran as well.
So the two sides have about 3 weeks to figure this out before it potentially gets more complicated. And so we have to hope that there's some private talks going on behind the scenes.
Fingers crossed.
All right. Iran's foreign minister over the weekend rejected new negotiations or changes in the deal in response to remarks from French President Macron that Saudi Arabia should be included in the talks. What is going on here? Is this a real problem, or is this something that the French are making up?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about sort of involving other stakeholders in new negotiations with Iran. I think this is likely made overcomplicated. There's a lot of trying to read into exactly what leaders are saying when they talk about new negotiations and who should be involved and things like that. I think there's general agreement that the first thing everyone wants to do is for the U.S. and Iran to come back into compliance with the nuclear deal. There are some within the Israeli government, within, the Saudi regime who don't want that to happen. But the key players, Iran, the US, the Europeans, they all want full compliance with the nuclear deal first. After that happens, the US and the Europeans are really concerned about a lot of Iran's other activities, their missile program, their human rights abuses, support for terrorism, all of those things. So the goal is to get to the point after we stabilize the nuclear deal where there will be negotiations with Iran on those other issues. There's also a lot of interest in, talking with the Saudis and reevaluating the US-Saudi relationship. So those are negotiations that will have to happen too. So when Macron is referring to new negotiations, he could be referring to any and all of the above. It certainly makes sense to engage the Saudis at some point, in these kinds of regional discussions. But the bottom line is that Macron is not changing his position. The French still want the U.S. and Iran back into compliance with the nuclear deal first.
Thanks. And last question. Last week, the Biden administration announced the appointment of Rob Malley, president of the International Crisis Group and one of the chief negotiators of the deal under President Obama, as special envoy to Iran. There was a lot of controversy about this. And tell us why there was so much controversy and what role Rob might play.
So this really was a manufactured controversy, and it's a shame. Rob is eminently qualified for this position. He has deep expertise in these issues. He's a seasoned diplomat. And, by all who know him, he's universally liked and respected and, really the perfect person for this position. The sort of manufactured outrage was coming from, frankly, critics of diplomacy with Iran, who sort of made Rob the proxy for the nuclear agreement. So they didn't like the nuclear deal. They don't want to negotiate with Iran at all. So they, made Rob the scapegoat for that kind of criticism. Fortunately, the Biden administration did not fall into this trap. They went through and appointed Rob as special envoy to Iran. And this has really given Rob's experience in the Iran negotiations. He was one of the architects of the nuclear deal under the Obama administration. So this is a good sign that the Biden administration is fully committed to bringing Iran back into compliance and returning the U.S. to compliance as well.
Wonderful. Well, Mary, our time is up. There's the siren. I want to thank you so much for being here, for helping us understand these complicated developments, and have a great day.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks as always to all our listeners.
Today, I'm sitting here with Dr. Robert Rosner, a theoretical physicist with the University of Chicago, where he's the William E. Rather Distinguished Service Professor in the Departments of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Physics, as well as the Enrico Fermi Institute and the Harris School of Public Policy Studies. Bob has served at Argonne National Laboratory as Chief Scientist and Laboratory Director, and was the founding chair of the US Department of Energy's National Laboratory Directors Council. It's a pleasure to be with you, Bob. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm also here with Professor Sharon Squassoni, a research professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs, Institute for International Science and Technology Policy at the George Washington University. She's also directed the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and was a senior scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, both in Washington, D.C. Sharon, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here, Emma.
Terrific. Now, both of you serve on the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. This is the body responsible for setting the hands of the Doomsday Clock, which measures how close experts perceive that humanity is to human-caused catastrophe. And Bob, you're the chair of the Science and Security Board. And
Correct.
We're recording this on Wednesday, January 27. And earlier this morning, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists held an event where you revealed what time the Doomsday Clock reads this year. For our listeners who don't know this, last year the clock was set to 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been since its inauguration in 1947. This year, it was set to 100 seconds to midnight, yet again. So no movement towards or away from midnight. Now, some people might be surprised at this. After all, we have a new administration, one whose approach to nuclear weapons and climate change is much sounder than the previous administration's. And in the first few days, we've seen an agreement between Presidents Biden and Putin to extend the New START treaty, the bedrock nuclear weapons agreement between the US and Russia that had threatened to lapse while Trump was in office. And the United States has also rejoined the Paris Agreement. So we've had some positive developments in just the first few days of President Biden's assumption of leadership. There's new hope for the future on a range of key global issues. So why then is it still 100 seconds to midnight in 2021 after the devastating year that we had on many levels in 2020? So clearly there are a lot of questions about how the clock gets set. So let's dive right into it. And I'd love to start with you, Bob, because today you and former California Governor Jerry Brown released an op-ed with CNN titled "The Most Dangerous Situation Humanity Has Ever Faced."
Right.
So what was your reasoning for keeping the Doomsday Clock where it is, as the closest it's ever been to midnight? And why hasn't it been adjusted in the wake of a new US administration?
So I think the easiest way to understand it is that you have to ask yourself, from the perspective of when we made the decision, there were events as the ones, in fact, that you mentioned, that were positive. In particular, the result of the November election in the US was definitely a highly positive event for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. But along with that story, there are also some remarkably negative events that also happened. For example, what happened on January 6th of this year, a remarkable event. Basically, a direct challenge to a democratic government in the United States, an attempt to really undo a properly run, not cheated election. There was no cheating going on at all. Yet there was violence. So unfortunately, what we saw from the point of view of the Science and Security Board is a set of, in each of the areas that we are concerned about, some positive developments, but also some distinctly negative developments. And overall, there is an additional cast of confusion that's come up that's gotten worse and worse. And something that we might even want to talk to, which is that when the Bulletin speaks to the various issues that concern us, whether it's nuclear weapons or climate change or threatening technologies, we're always doing this from the standpoint of a rational argument. That is, we'd like to have a debate, and debate in which the partners in the discussion are straightforward and make their points. But in a world in which there are active elements seeding disinformation, misinformation, and what I would just like plainly to call lies, those kinds of conversations are very difficult. They've been made more difficult. And perhaps the most challenging, in my view, is that while all of us can have roadmaps for how to improve things on the nuclear side or the climate side, we have ideas for how to attack those issues. I don't think anyone has come up with a sensible way of dealing with the misinformation epidemic. We don't know yet how to do it. I have this confidence, I have to admit, that eventually we'll figure it out. But I think we haven't yet figured it out. And it's really, really, really mystifying, quite frankly.
Sharon, do you agree with this analysis, and what else are you concerned about with respect to what got fed into the decision to make it 100 seconds to midnight?
You know, you sit in a room with other, I don't know how many science and security board members we have, maybe 20 altogether or so, and each a preeminent expert in their field. And the discussions are unbelievably interesting and vibrant. And, you know, we have some pretty spirited disagreements about things. But in the end, you wind up balancing many different sort of positive and negative developments, not just in the nuclear field, but also in climate and disruptive technologies. And on balance, what we discovered is that, you know, in the end, we concluded that the risks were still very, very high. You know, one example on climate change, right? The pandemic halted the world in its tracks, and the carbon emissions dropped 17%. But that, you know, started to come back up, started to rise again. And, you know, on balance, I don't think everybody wants the world to stop to, you know, just for a CO2 emissions drop. So, I think one of the developments that became clear to us in 2020, which is really, we were looking back at the year rather than forward. Although we did think about how the Biden administration and a different a relationship to the world might make some of these challenges a little easier to address. But, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic brought home the fact that our relationship to facts and science and reality and getting good information to people to make rational choices was really very much threatened in the last year. I anticipate, and probably other board members agree, that a renewed commitment to the truth and the role of science that we've seen so far in the Biden administration will have a positive impact. We're just not, you know, entirely there yet. A lot of the developments that the really kind of earth-shattering developments of the last couple months in the U.S. Political sphere are very, very recent. And I think next year's clock discussion is going to really be fascinating.
Yeah, it's true that we made our decision after the election, so we had high hopes that the new administration would basically go back to sensible goals in terms of what to do with energy policy, how to deal with carbon dioxide. But on the other hand, we also know that if you think worldwide, the amount of investment that's going into fossil fuel technologies remains higher than we are investing in clean technologies. And that is really, really disturbing, because you might think that, haven't we gotten the message that there is a problem? Well, not completely. And of course, the misinformation issue also plays a huge role.
So in thinking about this and thinking about how there really are global problems that are ahead of us, and how there are a number of issues that really interconnect and feed into the decision about where to set the clock. Earlier at the announcement event, Rachel Bronson, the president and CEO of the Bulletin, said that the pandemic was a historic wake-up call for our inability to collectively solve really complex and critical problems as a species. And Sharon, you come into this conversation with a tremendous amount of experience working with nuclear policy. So I think you'd agree that nuclear weapons are one of those complex problems. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to wake up to the dangers that these weapons pose? Do you think that's going to change at all in the coming months and years ahead?
We struggle with that. We really do. Among nuclear experts in the government and in academia and NGOs. And as a matter of fact, that was a topic in our little breakout session today. How do we get across the threat of these weapons? In the worst days of the Cold War, I think, even then, I'm not sure that the average American or Russian really knew the extent of or how high the cliff was, or how close we were to the precipice. I think that's one of the fundamental jobs of the Bulletin and the Doomsday Clock, to bring awareness to the issue so that people can educate themselves. That is perhaps one of the hardest questions. There was a question today from a member of the press on, what can I individually do? What should I tell my wife and my aunt? What can they do about the nuclear threat? And it's a little easier on climate change, right? Let's recycle, turn off lights. I mean, there's a whole list of things, and every morning I wake up, I feel really guilty about all the things I haven't done. But Jerry Brown answered that question, and he said, contact your representative, your political leaders, because they are the ones who make decisions on this. They can say whether we build a new set of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or, whether we slow down, procurement or negotiate with our adversaries. So that's one thing you can do. And then also just get educated.
I fear that it may be even more complicated, because if you think back to the Cold War days, so the 50s and 60s, one of the things that did happen that I think that the folks interested in non-proliferation issues succeeded was to penetrate the common media, the popular media. And the end result was that you had Hollywood producing movies, on the beach, that kind of stuff that reached a huge audience and they had an effect. They really had an effect. And they were not, we're not reaching what is quite frankly, it remains a minority of folks, of thinking folks, but you're reaching a very large group of people, a majority of people, ordinary folks. They got upset. I grew up in Germany, and I remember when I was a kid, the protests in Germany against the Long John, these are the intermediate range missiles that we had in Germany, pointing pointing east toward East Germany and beyond, and knowing that the Russians were pointing things at us. I was in Munich as a kid, and I was petrified. I mean, that was a visceral fear. And I think that sense, I don't think it's there in the public mind today. And I think, and this is something Governor Brown has brought up. It's as if we're kind of sleepwalking. I think he said something like that. There's somnambulance that we're experiencing. We're walking through a world not realizing how dangerous it really is. And in part, it's because we've kind of insulated ourselves against the news. We have. And it's tough to penetrate that. It really is difficult. And what Sharon said is absolutely right. I mean, we're going in directions right now, even with democratic administrations, which are not in a good direction. The quote modernization of the weapons programs hides the fact that we always say we don't develop new weapons. Well, guess what? There is a very fine line between developing new weapons and modernizing. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at what has actually happened, we basically have developed new weapon systems. We have done that.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and the hair trigger, in some sense, is still there. We still have this problem of one person can press the button, and that person doesn't have to consult anyone. How scary is that?
One thing always strikes me as truly remarkable, and that is after President Trump entered office, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, under the leadership of Bob Corker, held a hearing on nuclear command and control and the president's sole authority. It was the first hearing that they had held in 36 years. So, of course, the events of January 6th, suddenly Nancy Pelosi went to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and said, hey, can we do something about this? This might, we don't want our president, pushing the nuclear button. Of course, there's no button, but, launching a nuclear attack, in the remaining days of office. But the fact that we went for so many years without true congressional attention and oversight speaks to the kind of, I would almost say, neglect of, by Congress and, by many others, they're not the only ones at fault, of the incredible risks that these weapons pose to us really on a daily basis. I think that psychologically, it's difficult for people to contemplate extinction. It's hard to, you have to provide the message, two messages at the same time. One, this is a huge risk, but two, there's hope. We can do something about that. And fundamentally, I think that's at the basis of the Bulletin, which is we created these weapons and we should be able to control them. It takes some political will. It takes effort. It takes, hope and persistence. And that is a long-term project. But I think that's how we have to approach it, because you can't, some people just throw their hands up and say, well, this problem is too hard. It's not too hard. These are man-made, human-made weapons, and we need to be serious about the threat that they pose.
Yeah, and I think speaking about that hope, I was really touched this morning when I heard the former Prime Minister of Liberia and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and she said that this was a moment for global reset, to admit and learn from past mistakes and better prepare ourselves for future threats. And this is really all about human-caused catastrophe, as you mentioned. And so do you share that level of hope or belief that we will be able to get ourselves out of this mess?
I do. I mean, Bob is the physicist. I'm the political scientist. So, I believe that, political systems change. It's not easy. I wouldn't say I'm Pollyanna-ish about it. But if Greta Thunberg can stand up and make climate change seem like it's the most important thing in the world, and why aren't you adults doing something when, it's clearly an issue that you should be focused on? Why can't we do the same thing for nuclear weapons? You can put the call out on your podcast. We need a nuclear Greta to bring us home, to bring some common sense. I'm not naive. I've worked in the government a long time, and there are a lot of vested interests. The nuclear modernization is going to take more than $1 trillion and put it in the pockets of defense industry contractors. I mean, and it's important. Jobs are always important, but I think that we need to spend that money on other priorities.
So the first point is that Sharon is absolutely right, that we do know how to do that. There's no question that we know how to do that. As she said, these are human-designed things, and we know how to control them. The question is, do we have the will? And that immediately gets me to look, over to Sharon and to say, hello, you're the political scientist. Because the problem is not a technical problem. That's the key thing to understand here. Just like the pandemic, the problems with the pandemic, for example, in principle, were really not technical problems. There were scientific questions that had been not answered properly, that required some work. But we knew that they would be answered. We knew vaccines would come. All those things would happen. And if you ask what the failures were on the delivery of the systems that were supposed to do things, which is a political issue. It's not a technical issue. So we have this on the climate side. We have this on the nuclear side. It really has to do with this mysterious thing that physicists are always perplexed by, which is, how do you convince people of something that to me, for example, seems so perfectly obvious?
Yep.
And the problem is it's not perfectly obvious, especially when people are willing to distort the truth. So we come back to that issue again. The fact of the matter is, there's a point that Sharon just made. She was being very kind, I think, which is, there's money to be made here. So that means there are vested interests that really have no particular desire to see us spending less money on these weapon systems. There's money to be made in continuing to use fossil fuels. Think of all the sunk value that's sitting in the ground that all of a sudden becomes worthless in a world in which we're powered by renewables. And that's owned by somebody. And you can bet that those folks are not particularly interested in leaving that stuff on the ground. So these are the kinds of issues that we have. And the question is whether or not, Sharon described really, really well the discussions that we have on the Science and Security Board. We don't always agree. You have a bunch of pretty smart people that really know how to argue very well, and we're at each other, okay? But, and here's the key point, but this is not, they're not speaking from the point of view of vested interests. We're talking about trying to do the best we can, and there are differences of opinion sometimes about that. That's okay. But when you have other interests playing a role, like making money, then you do run into a problem. And now the rules may change. What are you willing to say? Are you willing to say things that are simply not true in your argument just to win your point? Really? Is that what you want to do?
Well, Bob and Sharon, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in those discussions. I'm sure it's absolutely fascinating. When you're having these discussions, do you have certain amount of seconds that you attribute to specific events or specific developments? How do you decide, what time it actually is?
Well, let me try my hand, and then Sharon. The first point is that when you talk about the clock and 100 seconds, it sounds so quantitative, and for that reason, you ask the question you asked is just perfectly appropriate. The point is that it's not about quantifying things. This is not a precision tool we're talking about.
Yeah.
What we're talking about more is a sense in which you're trying to answer the question, is it better or worse? And sending that signal. That's really what it's about.
So are you looking then, let's say last year the decision was made for 100. Presumably then you're not necessarily starting from scratch to build up how many seconds do we subtract.
It's always relative.
How is it relative?
It's a relative issue.
Oh, fascinating.
It's always relative. Right,
yep.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly
Terrific.
Right.
Terrific.
Which is actually a problem because the clock has been very close to midnight for a long time. And, I'm sure that some of the members, we have a perennial discussion about the clock real estate. We wish we had more time to play with, but, we're also kind of in a historical, we try to be a little bit faithful, I would say, Bob, to the historical context. So when we moved to 2 minutes to midnight, we had a long discussion about, okay, the last time the clock was at 2 minutes to midnight was when the Soviet Union had detonated a thermonuclear weapon. Do we really think, at that time it was a big deal, right? Do we really feel like we are at a place where it is that significant? And in the end, we did. And then we have moved forward a little bit. It's not just political will, it's psychology and perception. And when you look at nuclear deterrence, right, which is the big boulder in the path towards nuclear disarmament, right, there are some people, many, who believe that nuclear weapons deter the use of nuclear weapons from another country. But it's a belief, right? It's not. It's not anything that can be proven. And so as we look forward towards nuclear disarmament, the role of perceptions and psychology, what feels secure? How can we create that feeling of security without nuclear weapons is really, really important. And that goes back to the corruption of the information sphere, which we have witnessed over the last few years, and why that is such a huge development and something that we need to pay close attention to. In and of itself, it has tendrils or tentacles that reach into many, many different things. And it's also possible to, have a significant influence on nuclear developments, climate change, other kinds of disruptive technologies.
Fantastic. I'm glad you added that, Sharon. So I've got one last question for you before we leave. And I know it's way too early to tell, but given all of these developments you've talked about, the corruption of the information sphere, the issue of political will, psychology, perception, vested interests in keeping nuclear weapons, the jobs and the money, given the environment that we're in, all of these factors, if you had to hazard a guess, do you think the clock will be closer to midnight or further away from midnight when we talk again in a year?
How can we help but try to be optimistic? How can we help that?
Terrific.
That's what we're hoping for. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what we'll work for.
That's what we'll work for. Perfectly said.
Publishing good ideas from experts and others in the Bulletin, on the pages of the Bulletin, so that hopefully we can move in the right direction.
Right.
Terrific. And hopefully finding that nuclear Greta who can work with the Gretas of all the other movements to really make the connection about the importance of all of these issues for our future state of humanity. And I think this is a really terrific note, an optimistic note to end on. Really, thank you very much, Bob Rosner, Sharon Squassoni, for your excellent, fascinating discussion, and really for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the group of all of the really dedicated professionals who are raising awareness about nuclear risk. And it's 100 seconds to midnight now. Let's hope we're further away from midnight when we speak again.
Hear, hear.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, welcome back to everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A segment. Are you ready, Michelle?
Yes, I am.
This week's question comes from Chris in Virginia. Thank you, Chris. Chris asks, when I was a kid, I remember watching the nuke scene in Terminator 2 and feeling scared and shocked that a city could be blown up like that. Do you think that visual media is underutilized in your work? And is there a way to change that, especially with the advent of high-quality virtual reality?
Great question, Chris. And, I think that you hit on a lot of really important points there. One of the ones I want to draw out immediately is whether it's underutilized. So the atomic bomb has been very present in the media from its beginning to today, whether it's a plot device in movies, whether it's hope for a better tomorrow. There's been some examples of how it's been used to expose the horrors of nuclear war or the absurdity of our systems. Think Day After Tomorrow, Threads, Dr. Strangelove. But it's most often used to signal hopelessness or the darkest parts of human nature. And none of us gives us much agency. So think about how you feel after you see that type of movie. And Chris, you actually call that out by saying you remember feeling scared or shocked. Nowhere in there is that sense of what you can do to change it. And so, when we think about how it's been used so far, I would say that we've spent too much time focusing or allowing it to be used as something that paralyzes people, overwhelms them in trying to educate. And that's what we really need to change. So how do we do that? We have some really talented people out there like Lovely Amayam at Bomb Shelto who think about how to bring out some of the other stories around nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons complex. For example, what the lives of people who live on Navajo land look like surrounding the uranium mines. You can also think about, though, how it's actually used. You point to virtual reality. There's some really great research out there about how virtual reality actually tricks your brain into thinking you are in that situation. Your brain doesn't know the difference between what you're seeing on the screen and where you are actually at. So how can we use that, for example, to test what our decision making would be like in those situations? There's researchers in some of the top universities today who are considering, how we can actually use that to learn more about how leaders would react in specific situations where they're asked to decide whether or not to use nuclear weapons. So I think, in terms of underutilized, I think that for those looking to reduce nuclear risks, it hasn't been so much underutilized so much as not used to its fullest potential or have allowed the narrative to get away from them. So, going forward, what I really hope to see are more hopeful storylines, ones that really allow the viewer to feel that there is something they can do to change the situation, because that is the actual truth. By advocating for the policies that you want to see, you can create a safer world. And I hope to see that reflected in the media going forward.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Chris. Remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod on Twitter or send us an email at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.